Right now, everybody is talking about cryptocurrency, and the cybercriminals are hiding in the conversation. Cybercriminals use social engineering loaded with urgency and fear to successfully prey on your company, your employees, and your customers. Spear phishing is just one of 13 types of email threats. Barracuda has identified these 13 types and shows you how you can protect your company, your customers, and your reputation. Find out about the 13 email threat types and Barracuda email protection. Get your free ebook at securityweekly.com/Barracuda. That's securityweekly.com/Barracuda. Welcome back, everyone, to Paul's Security Weekly. Make sure you follow us on LinkedIn to get updates on our organization, show highlights, and more by searching for Security Weekly Productions. And we've added Mr. Lee Neely to the mix. Lee, welcome.
Oh, it's good to be here and not working, having this fun instead.
That's right. This is way more fun than work. Or is
Oh, yeah.
This is work? This isn't work. I mean,
No.
This isn't work.
we tell our significant others it's work.
Yes.
Let's be honest.
And they don't watch, so they don't know.
I think we should talk about RSA and how it's not really broken. I want to preface this with it's not really broken, which I think is the general consensus. And we might get really nerdy and go down several rabbit holes. But my TLDR was like, don't worry about this yet. And I think what made people, just to set the stage, what allowed people or triggered people to be worried about this was Bruce Schneier's post that I think if I had to level it down to one statement in his post, it is like sentences 2 and 3. This is something to take seriously. He didn't say might. He said this is something to take seriously. It might not be correct, but it's obviously not wrong. I wish he didn't write that. Like I think maybe he wishes he didn't write that. Because that makes it sound like it's something we got to pay attention to now. And if you read the rest of the article and the several other articles and talk to people that have read the other articles that actually understand the math, because I don't actually understand the math, but the summarization from the people who actually understand the math are like, we're not close to being broken. Sam is like jumping up and down in his seat. I can just
It's the same nonsense we've had many times. They used a quantum computer to do something mixed with a classical computer that wasn't anywhere near anything dangerous, and they made some false assumptions about how it would scale with size. Mm-hmm. So it's just like a bunch of other sort of crackpot proposals we've seen before. Nobody's ever demonstrated the ability to crack any RSA key of any significant size matters.
Even with 400 qubits.
Well, I don't know if those people have tried, the people with 400 qubits.
That's IBM. IBM has like a 400 and something qubit.
Yeah,
right?
in the 400 range right now.
Yeah, they have them, but I don't think they can actually crack prime composite numbers with them because they're too noisy. The qubits currently are very low quality.
It's the noise. I read and listened to things. People talk about the noisiness factor.
Yeah, right. There's no hardware that can do anything remotely dangerous yet with quantum computing, and nobody thinks there will be for 10 or 20 years.
Mm.
Correct. I get my. I completely agree. My take on it was that when I was reading this was that they're trying to get people to be more proactive, though, and thinking ahead to a time when maybe something will emerge instead of waiting until it happens and go, oh no.
But that's already happening. We have the NIST project underway, choosing quantum safe algorithms, and we're on the right track. We'll have them ready, and
I completely agree.
When they come out,
No, I completely agree. I mean, I don't think any. I mean, I assure you, if they could do this, they would be doing it, and doing it regularly. I mean,
Sam, to your point, if you tried to use a combination of quantum computing and classical computing, you wouldn't be trying to break RSA any faster than just using classical computing. Is the assumption that several experts in the field were drawing?
Yes.
Well, I don't know. There might be some speed up, but it's not enough to matter. The most important thing is it doesn't scale so slowly. They had some crazy, it scales as like log n times log of n or something, not even as fast as proportional to n. And that, if that was true, then it would really be dangerous.
Yeah.
But that's the part that's apparently not true.
But is that what they were saying the Schnorr algorithm would give them? And Schnorr's algorithm has not been, the Schnorr algorithm summary of the paper is this will break RSA encryption. But experts largely agree, like, no, dude, it doesn't break RSA encryption, and that's not a paper on quantum. That's just a paper.
It was in a theoretical vacuum. So if it was
right.
totally clean, yeah, the algorithm will work.
Was
but
that
that's not.
Was that lattice attacks? Is what I heard
remember what that was
reference
called,
and mentioned to that
but it was,
paper.
It was all this stuff that came out of pop media like a couple of
Yes.
years ago, where people started going, quantum computing, the whole world's going to end, and and it was these very simple articles that didn't really understand it, and they're just like, well, quantum's going to mean, this logarithmic expansion of capability, and every key, every crypto on the earth will be broken in 10 seconds the minute this hits, and who knows?
The positive thing, though, is like I read a bunch of stuff on this, and I found what I read to be very fascinating, and there was an article, what the heck is Schnorr? Because I had the same question, and this article... Tyler, I think I mentioned you in this one specifically because this talks about Schnorr's algorithm, which is specifically focused on ECDSA, the digital signature algorithm component, which is heavily used in Bitcoin and in blockchain. And the what the heck is Schnorr, like dug into that in some amazing detail. It said a couple of things in there that I couldn't go back and find an exact quote to. I'm like, I didn't know it worked like that. That is really fascinating. So if you need like a break from whatever you're working on, like go read that. That's a Medium article. It's actually not an academic paper. You can understand it a lot.
So what you're
better
saying,
than
it's
academic.
readable.
It's readable, unlike an academic paper with a lot of mathematical formulas that many of us don't pretend to understand, right? I even think Bruce was like, some of this math that they're referencing his papers is over his head as well.
Right.
And unless that's your field of expertise, probably so. But
So-
there was a whole train of like that Schnorr paper was because there's Shor's algorithm, which is something completely different, but also I believe Shor was looking at, was that a factoring attack against RSA that was yet different from Schnorr's attack? I linked to all these resources in our show notes, by the way.
So I
You went off
think
on
Mr. Jeff
quantum-
wants to
on
weigh
this.
in.
Yeah, go ahead, Jeff.
Well, I'm hung up on terms again, which is what I do. And when I was doing this kind of stuff back in the day, breaking something, coming up with a cryptographic attack, by definition was reducing the work factor. Figuring out a way to streamline or do it quicker than just brute force. I mean, everything is theoretically possible to be broken, with brute force given enough time, except for a one-time pad. And I'm just curious, and it probably doesn't matter, but I'm just curious whether, we're still talking about brute forcing. We're just talking about doing it faster because of a new thing, quantum. That makes it faster, but it's still brute force. So it's not really breaking. It's still brute forcing.
Well,
right?
The quantum factoring is not really brute force. It does not go through a series of testing keys. What it does is it designs a piece of hardware that will just resonate like a flute. So you feed in a composite number, and the factors it's composed of just come out due to the way the signals propagate through the medium. So it's like a hardware device that gets to the answer without passing through a series of guesses and iterations to get there.
Because it's a factoring attack rather than a brute force key attack.
Right. You can't really call it brute force. It's like if you blow in one end of a flute, the flute causes one pattern of notes to come out and the other patterns interfere destructively and don't come out. So you could call that brute force, but it isn't really an algorithm. It guesses various things. Just certain parts of the input are reinforced and build in the flute, and other parts cancel out.
But that sounds more like Shor's algorithm, which the title of his paper is Algorithms for Quantum Computation, Discrete Logarithms, and Factoring.
That's right. That's the Schnorr algorithm. That's the one that can crack. Yeah, Schnorr signatures are just what makes Bitcoin faster.
I gotcha.
And they just are a way for many people to sign a signature at once, and that makes it possible to combine transactions and make Bitcoin transactions faster and cheaper.
So that I think it was Schneier that said, we've long known from Shor's algorithm that factoring with a quantum computer is easy, but it takes a big quantum computer on the orders of millions of qubits to factor anything resembling the key sizes we use today.
Yes, and it takes much higher quality qubits with much less noise.
I gotcha.
That's why the hardware we have is many generations before the hardware that could do that.
I do also want to mention Security Cryptography Whatever has an episode that talks about this with Deidre Conley, who's amazing on the crypto side of things, as is Thomas Tacek and David Adrian are the hosts of that show. They did a great job covering it in even more detail. Even started to, like, lattice attacks is where it started to fall apart for me. I don't understand that.
Well, that's just actually it's closely related to a simple intuitive attack. That's how you factor something. You could guess. You could take 2 and then cross off all the even numbers on the number line, and then start with the prime number 3 and cross off every third one. So that's the part of, that's essentially how the fast attacks to factor prime number composite numbers work now.
Reducing the number of guesses, basically, based on math. Yeah. Also, just in case you weren't, like, at this point sure if this is something that you should be worried about or not, there's also people weigh in, like Scott Aronson, who is the Schlumberger Centennial Chair of Computer Science at the University of Texas and the director of the Quantum Information Center. I mean, he basically says no, just no. I mean, that's basically what Scott says, in case you're wondering if other experts wanted to weigh in what their thoughts were on this as well. I thought this was fascinating and some really interesting, as you can tell, I kind of went to town and pulling it all together in all the different references.
Yeah, the mathematics is great. The quantum computing is great, but it's all just for the future. Right now there's no practical use.
Yeah,
correct. Anything else you want to weigh in on this one?
Well, I was going to say the 2 things. One is that what I'm hearing is what we've got for quantum computing. Really, we can still go faster with our supercomputers than we can with what we've got in quantum, but that's because it's early. And the other thing I was thinking about when we were going through this is it's the old Gartner hype cycle. Forgive me, but the first step is this quantum. And it's basically an area where you have lots of promise, lots of hype, not a whole lot of actual repeatable results yet. And I think we're that early in the cycle before we get to repeatable, but we get expansions, and finally in the future, which is, as was said, a couple decades out, we get a useful product.
Kind of like fusion.
But, let's hopefully it's less than 60 years.
What it reminds me of, and some of the elder co-hosts might be able to fill in some of the gaps because I don't remember much about it, but it seems like in the 90s or maybe early 2000s, a lot of hype about superconductors that was going to revolutionize the world, and I haven't heard a mention of a superconductor probably since the 90s or the 2000s. Anybody remember that?
Ever since they couldn't make cold fusion with them, it's kind of been out of vogue.
Yeah, I mean, they still work on it, but yeah, it was the same kind of. It's just like the fusion we had. But
it was a lot of hype about it was going to blow up everything.
No, I know, and they had the thing with fusion a month or so ago, and it was like somebody, sort of in a lab got something to work, and then all of a sudden there's like a dozen articles going, "Is it the end of everything as we know it? Sell your stock." No. And it's like, no, it's not. It's like a long time in the future, maybe, and maybe not even then. Mm-hmm. So yeah, it's a lot like superconductors. Although it may have more promise than superconductors.
Except for this is maybe more real.
Yeah, I mean, they're actually doing it, and then superconductors have been a really twitchy thing, but they do have qubits, and they just don't have lots of them, and they're still in that sort of UNIVAC stage where the computer's the size of a warehouse, and, it's got liquid nitrogen and all this stuff that you're not going to be putting out there on the street anytime soon unless you've got Elon's budget or something like that, and say, I'll buy one of these for my house.
I do also want to say that I was listening to the Security Cryptography Whatever episode in the car with my 9-year-old, and he made the mistake of asking me, Dad, what are they talking about?
Oh, my God.
He's like,
my kid never had that problem.
He's like, what's RSA? And like pretty quickly he was like, all right.
Yeah.
Like
my kid learned that at a really early age. It's like, don't ever even ask.
It's asymmetric crypto. He's like, oh my god, like the public and private key. He's like, oh my God. I'm like, when you order stuff on Amazon, the reason that your transaction is secure is because of the work of these early folks that created these things.
Transmitted securely.
Yes, transmitted securely.
Yes.
Yes.
Good.
It was a fun
Jeff
conversation
Mann.
for me. Not so much for him.
Yeah. It's like, oh no.
What did I do?
Yeah.
I'll never ask again.
Don't ever ask about tech stuff.
It was fun. I had fun time trying to explain it. The harder one for me was explain quantum computing in the for a 9-year-old. That's when I'm like, I'm gonna have to get back to you on that one.
That's easy. Have them watch 2001: A Space Odyssey, and then,
and that clears everything up.
And that clears everything. I watched it as a 6-year-old, and I understood it better than
Now that explains a lot.
anytime I've seen it since.
What do we want? Do we want to talk about? Do we want to go Russia, or do we want to go exploit party? Where do we want to go next? What rabbit hole do we want to go down? All right, let's go Russia. So,
Russia it is.
Russian hackers are targeting U.S. nuclear scientists. Now, I want to say I read this headline and I expected more, but it's really just phishing attacks. I'm just throwing that out there. Like, the best I could tell from what limited information we have to work with right now is it's phishing attacks. And I'm pretty sure Cold River is also a vodka, which I think it's a potato vodka. I think it's more Polish vodka than Russian vodka. Although I'm not quite up to speed on my vodkas.
Is it most vodka potato?
No. Potato? No. Most vodka is it wheat? Corn?
Oh, no.
Corn. Most
Corn?
vodka is
Really? I
actually
didn't know
corn.
that.
Yes. Potato vodka actually tastes like potatoes.
Huh.
I use it in my drink recipes to specifically call for potato-based
You
vodka.
put like gravy on it. And
No. Definitely not. But I think most other vodka is corn.
I didn't know that.
Someone fact checked me on that, but I'm pretty sure it's corn. I think Tito's
To the
and stuff,
Google.
it's corn. In any case, Cold River is also a code name for a Russian hacking group, cyber criminal nation state hacking. How would you?
We're all wrong. It's rye.
It's rye. Okay, that was wrong. Is some vodka made from corn though, or am I wrong completely about corn?
I mean, I think you can technically make alcohol out of any grain.
Correct.
Yeah, I
What
think you can
constitutes
boil
calling
anything
it-
and turn it into
I
vodka.
mean, it all starts out as moonshine, as far as I'm concerned. I don't know what makes it vodka. I mean, whiskey, bourbon, scotch is
It's the barrel.
how it's aged.
Right.
I'm not sure what makes vodka vodka.
Maybe because it's not aged. It's just like
Yes.
distilled.
It's just anyway.
Like ferment anything. And
Back to Cold River.
This is stuff we need to figure out. Go ahead.
This is everyone's basically has no comment. I mean, everyone from the 3 national laboratories, the U.S. Department of Energy, the NSA, no big surprise there, Britain's GCHQ, everyone said basically no comment when asked for comment on this.
that's what they're supposed to do.
Which is, I mean, I just thought that was interesting that like most of this article was explaining all of the various agencies and countries that said no comment. It's just, I'm like, this article is absolutely hilarious.
Right.
And so several of the security researchers from several different firms have implicated in the Cold River group Andre Koronets. Did I say that right? Andre? We'll just say Andre, as one of the main figures behind Cold River. I mean, even in this Reuters article, if you read it, the evidence is like pretty overwhelming that they put in here that like Andre was also interesting. He was fined for hacking years ago in Russia and is now implicated in assisting in the hacks of Cold River, which has a long history and also very sloppy OPSEC because, I mean, there's just like a laundry list of firms that have collected intelligence about Cold River and gone like, yeah, like not only is it Russia, but it's this guy Andre who coincidentally was, got in some trouble for hacking stuff. So my read between the lines is like, oh, like you got caught and like now you basically work for the Russian government doing hacking stuff because you were caught doing it. Like, hey, you're good enough. Like, do some hacking for us now. or we're going to throw you in
You
prison.
can either set in an apartment building in St. Petersburg,
Yeah.
or you can go to the Gulag.
Right.
So what are you going to
What
do?
are you going to do? You're going to create something called
Start-
Cold River, and you're going to fish people from.
Start fishing laboratories.
Go do some fishing.
They've been
us.
doing that forever. I went to training on that in the 80s. You know, they were like, if a woman approaches you in a bar, and I was like, if any woman ever approaches me, I
Red
know
flag.
it's a foreign
Red
agent.
flag.
It's got to be it just doesn't happen. I've known people that had, that happened too. Like, people walked up and were like, "Can I get your number?" But like, if anybody approaches me, I assure you, it's a foreign agent. There's not a chance that it's not, unless it's like a Mooney or something.
So I have a two-part stupid question. Does Cold River have an APT number assigned to them, and what constitutes getting an APT number assigned to them?
They're not an APT group.
No, they're.
Does
kinda-
APTs always a group, and individuals you figure out what their name is?
Well,
He's not an individual either, or this group is not an individual. They're just not good enough to get APT level because they're not nation. They're not technically nation state.
They
It's
haven't
like
earned APT status.
Tyler, is this like the farm team? This is like the little league team?
Yeah, there you go. It's the single A hacker league. Yeah.
No comment.
I get Tyler's like refusing to comment.
No comment.
Oh,
It's
boy.
the farm system.
It's the farm system. It sounds like to me. Jeff. Also,
Yeah,
I
maybe.
think the APT numbering is Mandiant. Is Mandiant doing the APT numbering? Like various groups. Like I think it's Mandiant that uses the numbers. Microsoft uses some other
Code names.
Like
I think it's Elements or something. Like
Elements.
That. It's one of the.
Which is terrible because you can't Google them.
right. Yeah, I mean you'd want this. I would think you'd want to be Googleable. Sam, to your point.
CrowdStrike uses
Well, technically,
stupid
you'd want it to be
animals.
bingable.
Yeah, CrowdStrike uses animals. So Jeff, to answer your question of like what gives the like a criminal group or nation state group a moniker, it depends on
Status.
it depends on the organization, security researchers that find it and what organization they work for. They all have a different designation and
I
kind
think
of scheme.
Security Weekly should come up with our own designation.
Cool.
Like
I like
Clown.
that. Let's.
clowns.
Sure.
Yeah.
Cold River is.
Is there
clown
enough clowns for that?
32.
Oh, there's tons of clowns.
Bozo.
Yeah, you got your Bozos, your John Wayne Gacy's.
What was the one on In Living
Wow.
Color? Remember the show In Living Color?
Homie.
Homie the Clown.
Homie the clown. Homie, don't play that.
Homie. Maybe Cold River would be
Wow.
Homie.
Clarabelle. But you have
I mean, if your
yeah,
OPSEC's so sloppy.
Clarabelle. Even Harpo was a kind
Is
of
Ronald
clown.
McDonald a clown?
Yeah.
Or a
A
master?
really
He
scary
is.
clown.
Is he technically classified as a clown?
Yeah.
See, this guy. This is Ronald. Cold River's Ronald McDonald. You don't really know if it's a clown. It's kind of a half-ass try at a franchise moniker.
I
Yeah.
thought
If
this
Larry
story-
were here, he'd be out buying a domain Security Weekly clown list or
Right.
.com or something. Where are you, Larry? When we teach?
Yeah, I don't know.
Alright.
There's the fact that we can pinpoint geolocation, like multiple people have gotten locations. This is attributable to a person. Like the level of OPSEC failure here, and the number of people that are just tracking this because it's all trackable. Like this is not a huge surprise, and this is a pretty low level threat from a sophisticated. However, it is very interesting that it is directly targeting nuclear over the last 2 years, which we shouldn't be surprised. Like Kiev during the Ukraine invasion, there was direct correlation of allies with Kiev that had an important foundational knowledge that they were looking for, and or war crimes that were getting attributed to certain places. Like all of those things were kind of brought into the spotlight, and Russia was going after targeting and trying to get info and do misinformation as the war progressed. So that targeting could have been just put down the list to the low level, B team, like, hey, go fish this. We need you to do something now. Like you're on the pay.
Or just a shotgun.
payroll, so
I mean,
do
it's a shotgun blast, just like having people walk up to people in bars that are in towns where there were like secret labs and stuff and say, hey, I love America. Would you like to make some money? I mean, if you get lucky, you get lucky. If you get arrested and thrown in jail, you get arrested and thrown in jail. And the Russians go, I don't know who these idiots are.
Yep. It's just like the African prince, right? Or
Exactly.
Nigerian prince. Like it works because they shotgun approach it, and there's enough people that it happens. So that's kind of what this is referring to.
I mean,
Well,
the real
at it-
headline should have the word "again" at the end of it. I mean,
Yeah.
This crap's
Again,
been
yeah.
going on for 35 years.
More than that, probably.
Well, yeah. Well,
I mean,
okay, internet-based for 30
Yeah, I mean,
Early-
internet-based, which
35
makes it a
years.
lot easier. You don't even have to risk anything. You can just, email people with .gov addresses or.
Well, before they had to find them in person or call
What I'm
them on
saying,
the
they had to
phone.
actually come local and go to a bar or something and say, I wonder if those guys work at the lab. And I mean, that's what we were being trained against was like, when you go to a bar or a bowling alley and somebody comes up and approaches you, but now they can just email you and go, hello. No, I'm not a Russian. No way.
Also a nitpick because I got nothing better to do.
No kidding. When I was in Moscow on business, I got a call from the front desk. The 2 girls you ordered are here.
Mm.
Send them on up. Let's do a debrief here.
No.
See who hired them.
It's a different kind
So
of different kind
The
of
list of all the
exploit
organizations that didn't comment, they say the U.S. National Security Agency. Is there another national security agency besides the U.S. one? And
It was a funny nomiker.
Britain's GCHQ as opposed to Latvia's GCHQ?
Jeff, you don't have a need to know.
Yeah,
You're not cleared for that, Jeff. Not anymore.
Jeff is pointing out is the wonderful writing.
And now Jeff has
the
a
writing
headache.
skills of.
Oh yeah,
the
Paul and
folks.
I were kind of
Yeah.
bitching about some of the writing of some of these articles this week.
I guess when you get older
But-
and curmudgeon, you got to pick on things.
I mean, they
but-
make it sound more ominous and official.
Yeah,
but
some of it's on
what
purpose,
are-
Jeff. Yeah, I agree, but I think there is the bar's not very high for putting out written works, and I think when we've read as many written works
Yeah.
as we have preparing for the show every week, we're just like, oh,
If we combine this article with the quantum computing article, we can say quantum computing is trying to target Russian scientists with ChatGPT at U.S. nuclear labs. I mean, then you'll get that one right at the top of the search list.
Now, Jeff, the security versus compliance article, I didn't think
All
it was
right,
it
let's
wasn't
go there.
it wasn't horribly written though. I mean, it wasn't great, but it wasn't horrible. No,
But
like I guess
To
the
me,
writing,
it was-
the writing and
the
communication
writing style wasn't horrible.
Yeah.
To me, it was horrible in the sense of, sort of the suppositions that it makes, and I mean, if any casual person in this industry or newcomer to this industry hears, well, compliance does not equal security, what's the takeaway from that? To me, it implies don't do compliance. Compliance isn't worth doing. Compliance isn't worth your time of day. And that certainly is a pervasive attitude. I don't know that that helps anybody.
Yeah, it's kind of what
And
they led with right in the top kind of summary is that they say you end up spending too much time on controls that may already be out of date, and when there's no shortage of better uses of your resources. Essentially what they're saying there, Jeff, is like, don't waste your time on compliance, like
Right.
do security. And I don't necessarily believe that's glossing over a lot of other aspects of this particular
Yes.
Well,
topic.
yeah, it is. And I'm sure there's companies out there that have the maturity and the right frame of mind, the right culture where they're going to do security no matter what. I just haven't met the company yet that hasn't come to the table of security, either because they got breached way back in the day or because some regulatory compliance body has said, no, you got to do this. So, it's painting to me an inaccurate picture of what the role of compliance is in our industry.
Yes.
If that makes sense.
No, I think you're right. I think the way I frame it sometimes is that a lot of smaller companies don't think about security until such time they are faced with some kind of compliance and regulatory thing. And they're like, oh, if we want to go for this contract, we have to be conformant to this compliance standard. And that compliance standard is talking about all these security things, and we should probably do them. In that context, I don't think it's a bad thing. I think the air quotes bad thing is when they say, oh, we're working towards being compliant, therefore we're secure and we're done. We don't have to worry about it anymore. And that's where
And what's the shortest
negative
path to
connotation.
compliance? And
or
we
how
don't
can
take
we-
it seriously. We don't treat compliance as being something that will help us. It's just a bunch of tick boxes, and we have to find the person that will sign off on this as quickly as possible, even if we don't really do it. We just want this box checked so we can get that contract. And so the cybersecurity part is glossed over, and they say, we have passwords, right? And yeah, we use some, okay, yeah, we use strong passwords, sure, whatever. I mean, because I've seen that, and and they then compliance becomes this awful joke, and they say, well, it's not effective because, and I'm like, yeah, it's not effective because you don't actually do it. You just lie and fill out these forms and say you do stuff you don't do, and it's ridiculous because they lie.
So, yeah, which I always wonder. All those that are big proponents of compliance is not security. We'd rather do security. I'm like, okay, what are you basing your security on? How do you know you're doing enough? How do you know you're doing the right thing? What's your basis of saying we're secure or we're approaching security, if not some sort of standard or framework or something like that? Which, by the way, that's compliance.
Yes.
So it bugs me, and it to me it reinforces wrong thinking about compliance. And on a more specific example, somewhere towards the top, there's a paragraph that starts, "Compliance is critical," and they're like, well, here's some data points. So they got examples of what compliance does for you. So they say to hold patient data in the USA, you must be HIPAA compliant. That is, strictly speaking, a true statement, but that's not the only thing that involves HIPAA compliance.
Correct.
And it's worse than that.
To perform card payment transactions, you must be PCI compliant. Yeah, but that's this much of the PCI ecosystem. There's so much out there.
There's different levels, right, Jeff?
Yeah. Well, there's different levels, but there's let me speak to PCI. PCI is relevant, yes, obviously, if you're a merchant or a retailer, but and it certainly has to do with transactions mostly, but it doesn't have to be just payment card transactions. It's transmitting, processing, or storing credit card information, payment card information, or if you have the possibility of impacting the security of said data, whether it's yours or your clients. So it's a much broader net than simply just transactions. I mean, I had a client recently that, I have a client right now, but in a recent conversation, they're not doing transactions per se. They're a company that is offering to do debt consolidation. And in order to do debt consolidation, they're going to pay off their customers' credit cards. So to pay off their credit cards, they need the credit card numbers. So they're collecting a bunch of credit card information for a bunch of their customers. There's no transactions involved at all. And they're like, well, do we really have to do PCI if we're not doing transaction? Yes. Is this really the card data that you're talking about? Yes.
Because it's a data security standard. It's about the data. Yeah. Not
the data,
not the security controls.
Not necessarily what you're doing with the data.
Right. But I think
and then the final one is GDPR, and I can't speak to that because I'm not in.
But I think let's go to HIPAA is more of a data security standard because it's the handling of health information. I think in both those cases, the positive side to maybe folks like us is our data becomes more secure even if just less people store it. Right, and that's. I think one of the resounding things with HIPAA and PCI alike is that, less people store my credit card and my health data, so it puts it less at risk.
But if you did HIPAA correctly, you would have cybersecurity.
You could.
I
think a lot of these standards, yes.
You'd have to.
Yes.
I mean, you'd have to have back-end security on things in order to be compliant if you really did it correctly, if you didn't just gloss over things that are important and say, yeah, we got that. They put a lock on that door.
Yeah, well, that goes with any standard you're implementing. You have to implement it, and do your due diligence. You can't just gloss over and say, yeah, we got that. One of the interesting loopholes in HIPAA, the personal health data is not HIPAA if you're not involved in billing. So instead of following HIPAA, you have to follow privacy controls instead. I found out the information we have at my facility, which does not do billing of health-related activities, is not HIPAA data. It's an interest. So you got to watch what you're doing, and we have plenty of privacy roles. So
I
it's all
agree
good.
with what you're saying, Lee, but I think it's a little bit more subtle,
Well,
esoteric than
that's
that. 'Cause I think what they're trying to, I mean, they have to have rules, and I think what they're trying to do is to try to delineate or define enforcement and who has to follow from that perspective. They're not going to go after organizations that aren't kind of in this ballpark of healthcare billing, healthcare services. I think that's more what they're getting at. But it's true what you're saying.
Yeah. But your point about subtleties, you have to know what your compliance standards are, where the ins and outs are. And, oh, by the way, you need lawyers. It's the lawyers that clued me in on the HIPAA differences. But that's okay. You did all the help you can. And it also provides common language. When we say HIPAA, everybody know, or PCI, we have a common thing. If I come up with something obscure that's a security standard I want you to follow, it's going to be really hard to get started. So the compliance has more than just the check the box things. It actually helps reach a mutual understanding of what's required.
Well, so we're probably beating a dead horse, but these types of articles do not do anything to define compliance or security, for that matter, and they don't start with a definition and compare and contrast, because most people that sit down and actually have a decent conversation about compliance and security, most people, I think most of us, will say they're very interrelated. They're not binary. They're not an either or. And there's definitely potential for a lot of overlap. But for everybody that's ever told me, well, compliance does not equal security, I say, well, security does not equal security.
True.
No,
I agree.
All right. No. Good enough, Paul.
Yeah. Let's talk about bringing your own vulnerable driver attacks. It was a pretty cool article. This was more of a primer. I think if you haven't delved into kernels, kernel drivers, and in these type of attacks, this is a good article to read, and just help you conceptualize that delineation between user space and kernel space, what that affords you as an attacker. A driver can access and modify critical security structures, largely because it gives you the kernel mode access. Modifications can lead to privilege escalation, arbitrary read-write, and disabling security services responsible for the protection of the operating system. It is certainly the heart of the issue, and it did a good job of giving you a summary. What I think I liked best about this article was it pointed out, two different frameworks that are more about post-exploitation, right? Because we talk about, you bring your vulnerable driver, or there is a vulnerable driver on the system, and you exploit it, then what happens? What do you do? And Delicious and Evil mHyprot CLI are kind of like post-exploitation frameworks for, hey, if you got a vulnerable driver and you want to start executing code and doing stuff with it, here's what you would do to take away some of the protections that are reliant on a kernel that has integrity. Because basically, once you exploit a driver, the kernel has no longer has integrity and can't be trusted to implement any of these protection services, such as EDR, as an example. Although some EDRs, as we have talked about in the past, do have some detection and prevention against this. I'd still like to see that tested and under a microscope a little bit more, because I'm very curious about that. The one that I really liked was called Kernel Cactus. It is an entire project, including extensive documentation, that will, as they say, unlike other repositories mentioned, taken the ability to read and write kernel memory to the next level, creating helper functions to navigate the kernel from user mode. Really cool, and also very cool custom memes in their documentation that are funny to a small subset of people. I don't know if you saw the memes in there, but they're hilarious. Tyler, I think you're on mute, Tyler.
If he's on mute, I'm going to slip in a stupid question. I'm reading in the article their definition of what is a driver, which is probably as good a definition as anything. which is drivers are software that acts as an intermediary between the operating system and a device. What do drivers look like? What do drivers look like in the cloud? And
they're very much abstracted.
Well, so you still have hardware, right? Like the driver in a cloud is at the hypervisor level that's providing the SaaS.
Well, you do, but it's all to support infrastructure. The actual cloud. The typical cloud user, it's doing all software. Are there drivers involved, or things that kind of act like drivers? And what are we?
No, because there's no that you're abstracted away from the hardware. A driver's sole function and job is to provide functionality into a hardware device, or even, I guess there are some things where you're doing some video production, or maybe you're accessing a video card that is virtualized and providing direct I/O for performance for like CAD renderings and stuff. But most of the time that software is still abstracted and just provided as a UI through down to the hardware that is performing that. So your driver level is going to be handled at operations, which is almost always abstracted away. Even at like AWS, an instance, you have some virtual driver control, but that is very, very limited to what the hypervisor is providing as virtual drivers.
But it's not just hard. I'm hearing an echo. Sorry. Think of device drivers as hardware specific, but there's also drivers that let you access a file system. Yeah. For example, right? So it's not necessarily hardware. It is very much an abstraction layer between usually hardware, but sometimes other things that you need to interface with from user mode. And it's an extension of the kernel that gives. Well,
the virtual hardware in the cloud may still have a virtual driver that's accessing that, and then below that is that abstraction layer that accesses some physical piece of hardware somewhere. But if you have a, say, virtual NIC, which you can do on a VM, you've got a virtual NIC. There's a driver in your virtual operating system or whatever that's accessing that virtual NIC, which is then abstracted into the physical hardware through another driver. So there's multiple pieces of software in there somewhere.
It's a translation layer.
There you go. Thank you.
Yes, a driver is a translation layer. I think that's very accurately.
You can do a lot at the kernel level once you get kernel level, and that's not even a kernel level rootkit, right? We're just talking about kernel level access with a driver. So you're providing functionality, and each of these projects does a really good job of kind of delineating those two. But you start to talk about this, and there, if you're interested in learning how to develop your own driver and build things in like helper functions or port knocking, or even external artificial artifacts that can then queue something into the kernel level that is abstracted from, say, EDR, which is almost always operating in userland and userland hooks, sometimes with some kernel access, but can be hidden. All that stuff is done in something like Dark Side Ops by NetSpy now, formerly Silent Break. But you can kind of get into the nitty-gritty of that, or read some of the books around kernel level rootkits and how those rootkits provide and look for handles to files or processes that EDR is leveraging and abstracting the visibility down to your file. All that's usually done by a kernel level rootkit, which is just a much larger implementation of something like a driver, where the driver is loading the kernel level rootkit into process memory and then providing the abstraction and protection for it.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
I had nothing further, Your Honor.
Well said, Tyler.
I can't trump that, so I'm not going to argue with Tyler.
I mean,
that's what I like.
There's some fun stuff with kernel level. I want to just touch on, we've beaten ChatGPT and malware and OpenAI to like death over the last couple of weeks. It's probably worth mentioning that like this is probably going to be a continued moniker that's going to continue happening, so we should all just get used to it. But it really is getting.
Is ChatGPT the next WordPress?
I don't even know what it is. It's like the next Script Kiddie's wet dream that gets abused into lazy people's way to hack, so that they don't have to learn something that's actually valuable.
Although you can learn from it, because if you watch the news, yesterday, Aaron was running it on there, and he actually asked it to write a Python script that would, I think he did Rust. He was a Rust script that would encrypt his entire hard drive. because he was actually trying to get around their restrictions, and it wrote this beautiful piece of code that if you were trying to learn coding, that would be pretty useful. I completely agree. It's a script kiddie's, absolute wet dream kind of, scenario, because you no longer have to actually know anything. But it was an awfully
faster than Googling it and going to Stack Overflow and GitHub
absolutely, because it took very little time, and I could ask it I went home and was playing with all kinds of stuff, because I went home and asked it to write that Stack program, because that used to be an assignment in my networking class, was to write a C program that would actually send a packet over the network, and that was a really challenging assignment.
Well, if you've never done it before, it's a huge pain in the ass.
And I asked it to write it for me in several different languages, and it was just beautiful code. And I was like, wow, this would be a great starting point if you were trying to write something. And I just kept asking it, cool problems that I had seen in the past that I found challenging.
But what it can't do is it can't read and understand TCP/IP Illustrated Volume 1 by Richard Stevens.
No, it cannot. Right. Although, I don't know, maybe it can. I mean, that's probably online
be surprised
somewhere.
if it couldn't do that, honestly. I think that we have a couple things that we really have to think about as security practitioners, right? Like, this is the hacker's way to get around. Like, I make hacky-ass code. Like, all right, let's be real. I'm not a good coder. This teaches good code. This also introduces very dangerous code to people that may not know how to use it or control it. But it also
we call
opens
that
up
Security Weekly, Tyler, clown code. Keep going.
Clown code. Holy shit.
The Security Weekly clown code.
Yeah, if you look hard enough, you can find that on GitHub.
Clown code of the week.
We also have to think about, like, what does this mean from an education, a certification standpoint, the ability to vet people and the code that they've actually written versus something that they've had ChatGPT write and maybe modify. Like, this goes back to the whole plagiarism and being able to figure out and evaluate plagiarism from a paper writing standpoint. We've got the same problem with code now, and we have no way to vet actual knowledge and the use cases of those knowledges very quickly in a meaningful way for interviews, for certifications, for tests, and degrees that are being cheated on for classes. All of these things kind of have implications we have to think about a little bit and then find ways to not let the hackers hack around stuff. I love the fact that you can hack this and get good code and find novel, creative ways to bypass things, but it also lends itself to making sure that we are moving to the next level of how do we not let this interfere with good code and security.
But I will tell you about the cheating thing. So there's two reasons you're going to get caught if you do this. One is it's going to write better code than you will. And the people teaching the classes will usually look at that and go, that's odd. And two, you'll have to be the first person to use that code, because if every single person in the class turns in the exact same assignment, you're going to know something's going on. And most people that are teaching programming today scan all that stuff through some kind of an assessment tool that detects similar code, and you're going to pop them on it every time, because that thing's going to give you, it's like buying that term paper from the back of Rolling Stone. If you're the first person to turn it in, you'll get an A, but everybody else, they're going, hey, this was already turned in 17 times this week, and everybody fails.
ChatGPT, is this code written by AI?
I know, you're going to have to figure out a way to ask ChatGPT to write this code, but write it differently than you wrote it before.
I don't know. It has. I was listening to and it wasn't writing code, but I was listening to a podcast. I think it was Hacked, and they were like live on the air. Hey, ChatGPT, write me a description for this podcast and use fake words for the term hacking. And it did. It used like the term like hackery or something like that, like made up words about hacking, and it totally incorporated that. So I think if you prompt the AI with enough kind of things like that, you will get different results.
I ask it to write I ask it to write a program that would put a pop-up box on my screen.
Yep.
Just a very basic kind of program. And I asked it 3 different times in several different languages, and it produced pretty much the same code every single time.
Can you tell it now write it differently than you did
last
time?
Now you've got me thinking. I'm going to go home and go, write a pop-up box program, but you can't use this function or something like that, and see what it does. And we'll see how smart it is.
Write it in this style from...
Yeah, write it in the style of Ada Lovelace.
Yeah, write it in the style
I think the real place this becomes real valuable and or very dangerous is when you get someone that understands some of the data science and understands some of the data sets and how to program this with a more more custom data set and different parameters, then you can start to ask it, given the parameters that have been uploaded and the information and data that you have available, how would you go about stealing money from this company or ransoming this company, or what would you target from a supply chain in order to infiltrate this company? Like, you start to think about some of these from an attacker standpoint and how they can leverage this for very dangerous campaigns that actually can be very creative, that a human may not have thought of in such dynamic terms. And that's where it gets interesting. I'm all for this, for writing stupid emails and abstracting away stuff that we don't need to do, that wastes a lot of our time, especially from marketing, emails,
attending meetings,
programming,
ChatGPT,
all of those things. I think
assignment, but in the style of a Russian cyber criminal nation state gang.
Oh my gosh!
Would you get if you asked it to write it in the style of a
this comes back to the data sets and the information you provide. This, like, there's a lot that's in there, but there are a lot of guardrails that have been put up by like OpenAI and or the training models used, and some of the ethics committees that are providing the open and free source of this. But when you talk to people that know how to leverage AI and ML backends and really provide some granular training sets and data sets to leverage with customized information, then you really get a very, very smart and intellectual AI model that becomes very dangerous depending on what you're trying to do, or very intelligent.
Speaking of automated tools, I believe it was automated tools that found the discovery of some UEFI exploitation, specifically this time on ARM devices. UEFI is UEFI. There's a standard, and regardless of your architecture, like, the code is pretty similar. There's actually techniques to compare the code in UEFI implementations to the reference code. So I think Qualcomm and in others, but I think primarily Qualcomm's ARM systems were discovered to have vulnerabilities, and specifically some of these were with Dixie drivers, which we had Jesse Michael on the show and talked about SMM vulnerabilities and driver execution environment, or Dixie drivers. Different, as we talked about in that segment, from operating system level drivers, in essence, in the spirit of the same thing, but different. So this impacted a lot of different chipsets that crossed like everything from your Bluetooth headset all the way to your ARM-based, Windows-based ARM laptop. Interestingly enough, I actually got it from one of Kate Stewart's presentations that she was giving on when hobbyists go to space. The Mars rover runs Linux on a Snapdragon 801 processor.
Vulnerable.
Not vulnerable.
No, it's not.
No, I looked. I checked.
I thought they just announced it.
I would love that if there was a Dixie driver vulnerability in a Snapdragon 801 processor that's on Mars. No, it's missing from the list. There's 820, Snapdragon 820 is vulnerable,
it's a version,
but not 801. Yeah, I looked. Couldn't find it. Interesting.
Interplanetary hacking.
That's right.
Coming soon.
I just thought it was an interesting.
It survived the trip up. It survived all the stuff in the atmosphere and made the landing and started operating, and then that got hacked when it got down there. Nice.
Right.
There was a CERT advisory issued about a vulnerability in an alien operating system back on July 4th, 1996. Ring any bells? Earth. July 4th, Independence Day, Will Smith movie.
Oh.
That's the one where they uploaded a virus from a MacBook into an alien computer. Yeah, right.
Oh, right.
And
I can't even plug a MacBook into my PC, and they plugged it into an alien computer on a starship.
No, it was wireless.
Yeah.
They must have had USB ports.
It was a Thunderbolt adapter.
It was PCM-CIA at the time.
Pesky aliens.
It was all Wi-Fi.
Oh, yeah.
But there was a real CERT advisory issued against alien operating system vulnerability.
Well, it's good the more you know.
Back when the CERT had a sense of humor. Or they could afford to have a sense of humor.
Along the lines of UEFI, Matthew Garrett made a pretty cool post that talks about the setup variable in UEFI. So the crux of this is, if you use EFI tool to search the firmware for setup, it's a good chance you'll find a component that implements the setup UI, which for all intents and purposes is the UI that you would lovingly refer to as your BIOS, right?
Yep.
Running IFR extractor will pull out any IFR data fields, decompile that into something. And then now you've got basically a list of variables and offsets in the configuration associated with them. So even if what that means is if your firmware has chosen to hide those options from you, you can still set them. This is abuse of the setup variable. That one of the earlier talks to talk about that is, of course, one of my personal favorite talks, because I work for these fine folks now. They are the two of the three presenters of A Tale of One Software Bypass of Windows 8 Secure Boot. Yuri and Alex, the founders of Eclipsium, talked about abusing the setup variable in 2013, which is interesting. So the more kind of high level is that NVRAM is the area of storage, which is a sub-region in the BIOS region, typically on your SPI flash. The NVRAM region is where these variables are stored. Jesse, I believe, was talking about this when he came on the show. Users are allowed to write to certain variables in NVRAM. There's multiple different types of protection against these areas of SPI flash and these variables, and as to how they can be read and written. Some of this will be included in my upcoming talk that I'll be giving at ShmooCon in a couple of weeks. But specifically, a practical example of that is if you need to update your secure boot keys. Let's say your platform key, key exchange key, DBDBX, those are accessible by the user, so you can rewrite those. Actually gets ultimately written into NVRAM. So by playing around with some stuff in there, you may or may not be able to do writing depending on multiple different configuration settings and firmware settings. So Matthew Garrett was talking about this to basically bypass something that he was trying to do with he didn't say exactly what the hardware and software was he was working with, but talked about this to get around writing a variable that wasn't normally writable in the BIOS screen. So I thought it was pretty cool.
Take that to the next level. You got Intel AMT that you can abuse as part of your next story.
Different levels of protections. I talked about this in my blog post series. Tyler, very, very true. If you've ever tried to research how you could remove Intel AMT from your system, you'd start to get down a rabbit hole of why it's so difficult. The reason you can actually crunch down ME on there is because each of the ME firmware components that are stored typically in the ME region of your SPI flash are individually signed. So if they had signed like the whole thing, but I think they do this because other OEMs have to customize it, so they only sign the certain modules. But had they signed like the whole thing, you wouldn't be able to modify it. I believe because, and this depends on a lot of things, but there are keys fused onto the board and some of the chips that implement those cryptographic signatures and protect it. But I can remove modules since they're individually signed, and pair. What they do is they pare down Intel ME into the very bare minimum modules that need to run. And that's what ultimately you would need to write to your SPI flash, typically with a SPI controller that's physically connected to your SPI flash chip, which I should have said it before I said that, before someone gets really excited and wants to go try that. Like, I don't recommend that you try that and do that.
Sounds very dangerous.
If you do that at your own risk.
Yeah,
and
be sure it's disposable.
There are very, very severe consequences if you get this wrong. Like you could, as I'll describe in my Shmook content, like you're going to, air quotes, permanently break your system, potentially. So, but fun and games with AMT is looking at the software side. So AMT is active management technology. I've talked about it's a module that's included in the ME firmware. So like if you see vPro or not vPro, when you have a vPro system, typically that means in your Intel ME or CSME, they've included a module in the firmware called AMT or active management technology that has like this web management server that lets you do stuff. What I didn't know until, here's like two of my favorite firmware people. I've got like this list of really awesome firmware people. Some of them I have the privilege of working with in my day job. Others are Matthew Garrett, who I talked about in the article previous. This one is Nicholas Stark. And I follow both their blogs religiously because I'm a huge UV and firmware nerd now. And so I follow these very specific people. And what Nicholas Stark was talking about is inside of AMT, what I just thought, and I didn't know, was like I understand maybe why you would do this, but basically you can upload arbitrary files to AMT and serve them on a web server to other systems that are running AMT. And I'm like, what? Like you basically
it's like the best low-level worm module on the planet.
Like you just basically included a file upload vulnerability inside of Intel's AMT. I'm like, this is just astonishing. Like, I understand if you need to get a file to all these systems, even if they're powered off and you're rebuilding them, you may want this functionality. But this is conceivably some of the lowest level code that is running on your hardware. This code runs when your system is powered off. As long as the power supply has a plug in it, the chipsets that run ME and AMT are powered on and running. And that AMT software gives you the ability to basically publish arbitrary files on a web server.
EDR is not going to be able to stop this operating system and files being hosted for malware.
It's just crazy. And now what he talked about was an admin versus admin attack, where there was an admin, you were able to create a new admin account and trick the other admin into doing things to kind of blame it on the other admin, and talked about that aspect of it. But I just thought
wait till ransomware gets a hold of this and starts hosting their propagation script across networks and environments.
You know what? And one of the other interesting things about AMT is, as I'm learning, is the provisioning state of AMT, which I can't remember all of them. I believe it's in my blog post on the Eclipsium blog, but there's different states. There's like provisioned, not provisioned. There's like provisioned but not fully enabled. There's like some weird states in AMT, and it's really hard to determine what state they're in. And some states are like more vulnerable than others. Like if it's not provisioned, you could go ahead and provision it. Like there's some weird attacks that I don't think are very widely publicized.
And it provides some unique capabilities too, not just like file upload or changing an IP to an out-of-band manager. Like you have the ability to get to like KVM and console level, so you can look at the actual physical state of the hardware, which provides other interesting things like being able to mount files or drives to bypass authentication. There's a whole bunch of attacks that we've been using for a little while, kind of around this. So it's pretty dangerous.
There's a lot of somewhat theoretical stuff too that I tend to bring up with people.
I don't think people think evil enough with this. Or they don't understand it or don't know like the full capability, because we've walked through several of these and I keep finding new things that like you could run this rat race and rabbit hole for quite a while and come up with even more nefarious things that are scalable, wormable, leverage for ransomware, destructive attacks, all kinds of stuff that just have not been demonstrated by a sophisticated actor yet that I've seen.
And one of the things I might include in my talk, but it's hard to test, because like who wants to volunteer that I just write over like random parts of your spy flash on your computer? But what if I overwrite the gigabit Ethernet configuration region? And that's the system where the system reads Intel gigabit Ethernet information. There's a region on the spy flash for that. I'll talk about the region in my talk, but like if I wipe that out, does that mean I could potentially render even AMT inoperational, because AMT relies on configuration in that spy flash? In other words, like AMT's thing is like if my operating system is completely wiped out, I can remotely access the server and I can install a new operating system. But I need an Ethernet adapter to do that. But if I've wiped out the configuration on the spy flash that the gigabit Ethernet adapter is reading at that very low level, did I just render your AMT and your ME inoperable?
Well, this is not.
That's the question. This
is a question to your question though. If you I don't know the answer. If you wipe that out, would it stay wiped out though? Was like the next call not reload that from ROM?
If that's
actually in there.
Powered on the server and powered it back on, if the ME firmware kind of like an NVRAM thing, if it rewrote it every time,
you'd have to power cycle it.
I don't know, but
I
it
just
writes
wondered
things
if the
like,
call actually would load.
Depends
that
on what you did to that.
No, but like it writes things like the MAC address in there. So like,
well, I know, but I'm just wondering if that's
stored anywhere. I think that's the ground level zero storage for like where I store my MAC address. If that gets wiped out, your MAC address isn't stored anywhere else.
No, I mean that would be a problem, but yeah.
Yeah, I mean, doesn't it come back to what is if you did a BIOS reset, what's put back versus what persists or is lost?
Yeah.
I mean, I think you could have some fun messing with say that gigabit Ethernet tap or tell it only does less than a fraction of a megabit per second. Just confuse the hell out of them.
And once again, kids, if you try this at home, you're probably not going to be using that equipment anymore. So
yeah, Intel, if you're listening, we could definitely use some demo boards and an SDK and a few other things that we can brick and reset.
Yeah, I have heard where messing with that stuff can definitely brick your system.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. And I don't want to give attackers any shit. I don't want to give them code that does this because I'm scared.
I wouldn't.
Just throwing that out there. Yeah. Like if you're going to my talk looking for code exactly how to do this, probably
just redact it.
I'm kind of, I'm not.
Just ask ChatGPT.
I'll give you some hints. You could ask ChatGPT. I'll give you some hints, right? But like a full map and toolkit, I'm like, that's because the only conceivable usage of that is to destroy things. That's why I'm hesitant.
Yeah.
So, yeah, that was fun for me because, well, I guess you don't need to go to my ShmooCon talk now because you got a lot of listen to the show. So come hang out and have some drinks with me.
Well, it's not recorded,
ShmooCon.
and I'm not gonna miss it anyway. Hey, Paul, since I was responsible and actually put up some stories, I'm going to highlight a couple, if I may.
Please do.
Your article about security versus compliance, they mentioned something about, $1 billion fines being levied. And I'm like, really? There's been $1 billion fine? So I found an article, my article number 2. We don't need to go there, but I'm sorry, not 2. Which one was it? 4. I found a site that lists the 12 biggest data breach fines, and there actually has been a $1 billion fine levied against a company. Who knew? Huh. It's Chinese, but I don't know if that counts because the article was talking about America and U.S. stuff. But to dovetail on our earlier compliance versus security and the poorly written articles discussion, the one article I want to spend a little bit of time on is my number 1 is mandatory password expiration helping or hurting your password security. I think that's a fair question to ask. I don't necessarily like the points that were brought up in the article in terms of justifying whether why password expiration is not a good thing, because they're basically saying, well, the bad guys are going to have more than enough time because PCI set the standard at 90 days. I don't know if anybody else set the standard at 90 days, but 90 days has been most everybody's standard for as long as I can remember, until NIST changed it a couple years ago. But again, in terms of sort of passing bad information or false information into an article and getting people to spin off on it, there's a statement in this article that they bring up PCI and they say even PCI, even is my added word, PCI 4.0, which goes into effect in 2024, still requires scheduled password changes. That's and let me finish it. The 4.0 version of the PCI DSS standards require organizations to use passwords that are at least 12 characters in length, with some exceptions, and that passwords be changed every 90 days. Yes and no. PCI 4.0 only requires 90-day password rotation if you're not using multi-factor authentication, and there's other requirements that basically, if you're going to log into the card data environment, which is what everybody cares about in the PCI world, you got to use multi-factor authentication, two-factor authentication. So, they've got this remaining requirement that says, you can still do, if for some reason you can't do multi-factor authentication, still change the password every 90 days. That's a lot different from saying, well, even PCI still requires a 90-day password change. So I don't like that they sort of give misleading, technically true, but doesn't tell the whole story information. But they're basically they have 2 points. The hackers are going to get it anyway. What was their second point? And end users are tired of having to change their passwords when they've picked perfectly good passwords. That to me is not a strong argument. So my question to my esteemed set of co-hosts is, what are some good reasons to bring up on whether 90-day password changes is helping or hurting security?
I think you should definitely change your password if someone else knows what it is.
Right.
Good.
90 days, like that's kind of old advice that's going back to an earlier discussion I think we had at the roundtable or at some point, Jeff, where we talked about this. You're talking about brute forcing a password and the ability for password crackers for the length of your password and the time in which it is active. Can those two deltas be minimized based on the change length cracking possibilities? Well, that doesn't negate the fact that the Active Directory, and if a password is stolen from a breach box, it is in clear text. If there's not certain LSAS protections or certain Windows protections, the password storage isn't stored in clear text. It's not in a file or a password vault that is open and able to be looked at by the attacker. So password length and the time in which you change it is only stopping one part of this. We really need to get down to the psyche of the end user and getting these shared passwords across multiple services that could be breached and typically are stored in clear text. So onus on the vendors of these applications that store it in clear text and don't protect our passwords with good crypto, then that's where we really need to be putting the focus and the effort, and not so much on the nuance of whether it's 90 days or 180 days or what's the length. Like, yes, those are kind of important, entropy matters, but at the end of the day, I care more about whether they've shared that across multiple things, whether it's been in a breach, whether it's reused and in a knowable pattern, and if that knowable pattern has been disclosed in some clear text manner, whether it's on the breach of a box with inside of an internal network or whether that's a service or application that's been breached. All of those things are what we really need to be focusing our effort, energy, and training on.
Yeah, I think we were just talking about it last week, Tyler, when we were talking about LastPass and things associated with using a password manager and I'm still sort of on this bender about just have a really, really good password and remember it and keep it in your head.
See, password managers are actually very scary when you think about it. Like you're saying, Jeff, like we put all this faith in password managers, and that's just if someone steals the password manager database, like the file from that. But people don't realize that if I have RDP access or I have VNC access or I have command and control a rat with inside of your computer that I've compromised, something like Quackbot or any of the ransomware C2s, Cobalt Strike, I have full graphical access to your device. I can simply click your browser and look at your password when you're not active on the machine. So now I've got access to all those passwords. So there's multiple things that people just don't think about from an attack standpoint, and they think it's all, automated graphical command line, like extracting a file, database, breaking that master password. Well, I don't want to break the master password. Just like encryption at rest versus encryption in transit. Like, okay, I'm not trying to intercept your traffic and break, RSA. I'm literally waiting till it gets to the database, it's unencrypted, and put in a column where I'm able to query that and pull the clear text out. Like, people don't think through when they just see it's encrypted end to end, that's safe, or it's encrypted in the database with, the highest level of cryptography. Okay, well, if it's unencrypted on the device, I just get access to the device, and now I've got access to the data. Like, we have to think through this from an attacker's mindset and the ease of use and ease of accessibility to this data and how it's actually going to be breached, not necessarily the nuances of, whatever.
I agree with where you're going with this, Tyler, and I might hit you up later because I almost think there's a talk here in terms of sort of my generic thought is, some of the old rules, and we had talked about this over the last weeks or months going back to the round table. Actually, it goes back further than that, but like the original definition of what constitutes two-factor authentication, the idea of something you have, something you know, and something you are. And we had talked, back in October, November, I forget which episode it was, where we were talking about, and I was pretty much conceding, okay, well, maybe we need to change the rules because nobody has the something anymore. It's all password managers. It's all something else. There's new and different things, and I've been rethinking that lately since the LastPass incident that happened over the break. That I think it would be a worthwhile exercise to talk about and sort of, break it down in terms of a talk, what are the different things that can go wrong with a password? What are the protections and security recommendations or requirements that PCI and other things talk about as best practices for password protection, or and more generically authentication? What are all the popular automated solutions out there doing for you? And maybe it's a matrix or a table ultimately, but what bad things can happen? What are the tools and solutions address? What do they not address? And sort it all out and see where we end up at the end of the day. I have a hunch that maybe, just maybe, I was premature in saying we need to throw away some of the old original definitions. I think maybe there's more to it than not. Maybe we need to rethink them again. I think that's a talk. Personally,
I think there's two things with password expirations that somewhat concern me. If you ask users too often, and that's kind of arbitrary, like what determines too often, but the danger becomes that they start to choose weaker passwords or use a weaker pattern if they're asked too often. The other thing is, if you ask them too often without any prompting or event that would trigger it, just to change their password, they're going to be desensitized to that password changing process. So when Tyler comes along and is able to construct a phishing attack that asks someone to change their password, they're like, IT's always asking me to change my password. It's so annoying. And they're just going to do it. So you have to keep those things in mind. I think the third thing aspect is, as an organization, in what you're protecting, if you're not able to detect nefarious account activity, and you're relying on password changes in multi-factor, I think that needs to be balanced, right? If someone is trying to log in with my account from somewhere new, even personal protection like your Gmail account and Facebook account, it's going to send you an email and go, hey, someone's trying to log in from this place you've never logged into before. I think organizations also need that technology and that behavior detection and be able to disable that account right away.
That's one of the single best protections that I think an organization for password management can have. Both the conditional access and behavioral analytics for suspicious logins, both of which are available in basically everything out there. But Azure AD and the hybrid cloud sync, even your O365 has those in certain license levels like E3 or E5. So making sure conditional access and or suspicious login activities from a behavioral standpoint, there's no way for an attacker to know that those are active and enabled. So it is very difficult for them to attack that and not set something off. It's just like a honey token, right? Like there's very few ways to detect honey tokens unless they're poorly done. And once you do trip those up, you have a limited number of hopefully you have a limited amount of time to conduct the activity that you were after, and you get stuff set up prior to being kicked out. So those are very useful mitigations that are almost always free and almost always built into most SaaS applications and or online identity provider. However, most places by default do not enable those because of the end user adoption and the proclivity of how the end user actually has to deal with that. There's a nuance, and people don't like to have to do those extra steps, so they don't enable them by default.
Well, you're beating around that dirty word of convenience, and convenience trumps security. But overall, what I'm hearing you guys saying is that you're talking about behavior analysis, which I agree with. In the old days, we called that OPSEC, operational security. And I continue to be more and more convinced that the old way of looking at this hasn't changed. Maybe the technology wasn't there for a while to do behavior analysis the way it's required to be done in today's modern world, but the concepts, I think, still stand. And I'm going to stick to.
I think there's some other pieces we have that today that didn't exist back then, Jeff. It's now possible.
There are certainly other pieces, but I think they're all variations on a theme. I'm sorry, Lee, go ahead.
Now you can get a service that will let you query a breached password database, and there are ways to do it securely that doesn't give away what your hashes are, and determine if you've got breached passwords in your AD, for example, in your forest.
And
you can do it while there are things like that that can help you raise the bar and help your users. It's that we couldn't have done, 20 years ago.
Absolutely.
And you need the user stuff too. I'm not saying no, but there's other things. And as Tyler, these aren't necessarily free, but spend a little money. But if you've already paid for something like Tyler said, frickin' turn it on.
Yep. Yeah, and also when you change your passwords, make sure you do that from a secure system. Air quotes secure.
That too. But system. I think
that was part of incident response. We would do that back in university all the time. Back when there was network worms running around and stuff was getting popped left and right. And I'd go to I'm like, you need to change your password. And they're like, okay. I'm like, no, not from that system. Yeah. You need to go to a clean system.
It's okay. I did it over Telnet.
Yeah.
Well, mine is telling people to change their passwords just gives people a false sense of security.
That too.
And you should be changing your passwords when they've been breached or when somebody else knows it. You should never use the same password twice. But, having people just regularly change their passwords every 30 days or whatever, I think that just isn't a solution that does any real good, because if they're getting breached or if they've been breached and they're just using the same passwords over and over again, and, you start thinking about how many passwords you have. I mean, it may be thousands. And
I cut that down and I use a key. I use a key,
well,
but then the hard part about keys is what if you need to change out the key, because then you got to change out the other half of the key. And you got.
But Paul, serious question: are you using the key because you believe in your heart that it's a more secure way of doing things, or are you using it because it's just more pragmatically convenient and easier, and it's a way that you can, have a handle on all, the 100 passwords that you.
Yeah, I think it's both, Jeff, and I think I'll go to SSH keys.
But if you had to lean one way or the other, I have a feeling we're making security decisions.
Yeah, it depends on the application. What I'm primarily referring to is like SSH keys. If I I probably have 50 systems, right, that I could log into via SSH. Am I going to try and remember 50 different unique passwords, or am I just going to really super protect one key that gets me into those? And by the way, bonus, I can disable password-based authentication via SSH on all those systems. And I could probably couple in some kind of two-factor thing as well if I really wanted to get fancy, which actually isn't that hard to implement either. I think that's pretty good security. The flip side of that is when I need to rotate those keys out, that's where you start getting into commercial solutions like SSH.com and other solutions.
I was just going to say, like, we do not have from a consumer base, and I would even venture to say from a commercial base application, we don't have a convenient and good way to help people post breach. So your passwords are breached. You need to change all your stuff. Maybe your identity's stolen. Like, we do not have great services out there that run through very quickly, handle a breach, incident response for a person where they can change all their password, get MFA reset, maybe they have SIM swapping, ensure that all of those things happen very quickly and are done securely across all of their services. I've had to do this a couple times myself, and 200 or 300 passwords. Automating that even from a programmatic standpoint is not easy. Not everything has an API. Not everything is changeable. Like, evaluating the risk and priority of which systems need to be changed the quickest and in the most secure manner. Am I doing that from a VM? Am I modifying a key for two-factor? Am I resetting all my two-factor and disabling it so I can get back in and using backup keys, because all of my backup keys are the only things working? Like, there's a bunch of things that we have not made easy for consumers and or the commercial side to manage passwords, identities, and post-breach or proactive breach responses to things like passwords getting stolen or identities getting stolen.
Yeah. And from the sysadmin perspective too, like, cutting off the branch you're standing on is also a thing. You got to be careful. If I got to go reset a bunch of keys or whatever, right? Like,
your phone gets compromised, that's where your two-factor's at, and your accounts are compromised. Like, this is a scenario I've been down. That is a nightmare because of, like, where are my backup keys stored? Can I disable two-factor, reset the password, and put two-factor back on with new backup keys before someone has the ability to get in and mitigate the stuff that I'm already doing because they have the same access? Like, these are big issues for people. Like, heaven forbid the regular user has to try and do this on their own once their identity's stolen. Like I've helped a lot of people with identity theft, and it's a nightmare when you're a high net worth individual or a high profile individual that these actors are very motivated to keep access to things or have cut the access and changed things. It's very difficult to do this.
So I had a question for Paul real quick. You said, in terms of all your secure shell keys, I think you used the term number 300. You said you'd rather have the one key that unlocks them all. I'm assuming you're talking about the password that unlocks I'm assuming it's a YubiKey, something like that.
Well, no, there's multiple layers to that. So you have, in the context of SSH, there's a lot of options. So I could have a private key, right?
Right.
That is trusted.
Right.
The public key is on all the systems that I SSH to. I need a passphrase to unlock that private key. So that's another aspect to it. But then I can
passphrase is a euphemism for a really long password.
Right. A password to unlock the key, right? Typically we'll reference that as a passphrase. That's I think how just the software references it. But then I could also require that the system I'm SSHing to also require a multi-factor token from YubiKey. In Linux, all that's like relatively easy to set up in a small scale. Well, I guess my point was when you start getting to hundreds and thousands of systems that have to do that, I think we had Teleport on as a sponsor. That's where you start needing a commercial solution or some maybe there's open source solutions that I'm not aware of that could probably help you with this too. But managing access across hundreds and thousands of systems with keys and the ability to revoke and renew a key across hundreds or thousands of systems is something you're going to need not just a process for, but you're going to need some tooling to get that done. My 25 to 50 systems, maybe not, don't need a whole lot of tooling to do that, right? But you get in hundreds of thousands, you need tooling to do that.
But I don't want to go way off on a tangent. The old timer in me doesn't like the idea of putting all my eggs in one basket. And how is, as you've described, relying on, a key to unlock other keys, however that's being done, how is that better or different than what I've been thinking about lately is I just come up with a really long, really secure, robust key and reuse it in a bunch of different places. How is using as a password, using a really good, strong password that nobody's going to crack in a billion years, assuming they steal the hash and not get the plain text, which is a whole nother, argument. How, what's better, having a really long password and use it in many different places because it can't be cracked, broken, versus putting a whole bunch of passwords in one place and having a single password that unlocks it, assuming that's also a good password.
It's an interesting question. I mean, if we look at, let's say I have 25 systems and I have a really long password and I use that same password across all 25 systems, how is that compared to I have the same key that's trusted on those 25 systems, right? In some ways, not a whole lot of difference. I think from a sysadmin perspective, the advantage it gives you is that you could turn off password-based authentication entirely and eliminate a class of attacks or a certain attack path of someone guessing or brute forcing a password because they would need a key. So, I mean, I don't know. There's some trade-offs there. Again, it depends on what kind of systems you're protecting, what access methods you're trying to protect. If you can implement some of these methods such as key-based authentication and reduce your attack surface, I think it's good. But if you compare it, Jeff, just like a good password versus a key, in some ways they're not all that dissimilar.
Yeah, I mean, ultimately I think there's a lot of trade-off, and I think what's often my final commentary on some of the the articles like the one that I brought out is because this article ultimately led to a sales pitch essentially. Oh, if you're worried about all this, we've got this great solution that does whatever password management. I didn't read that part of it. I think it would be better, and this is where I'm thinking maybe there's a seed of a talk in here. Maybe I'll do it with Tyler, but I would love to see a definitive list of all the things that could go wrong with a password or authentication in general, and just try to chart out all the pros and cons, and what could happen, the likelihoods and the risk and the threat and all that kind of stuff for all the different types of things, and then try to map okay, there's these solutions out there, or even these concepts. Why do you change a password? Historically, it's because somebody's got the hash and they're trying to crack it, and it's gonna fall over time, or other reasons, versus all the different ways where the password is showing up in plain text, stored in places that nobody ever thought about, and it's stolen. Just brute forcing versus password stuffing. All these different angles and perspectives. I'm curious to kind of map it out all in my head, and I think if it's interesting to me, hopefully it'd be interesting to other people. And I bring this up ultimately, and this will be my final thought on this, because I know we've had this conversation in the last couple months. Again, forget the episode where we've talked about, after 30 years of all this, what are still the fundamental problems that we're dealing with as an industry, as a world, in terms of security. It's authentication, weak passwords, some sort of password exploitation, and trust. And I know the one episode I was thinking of, we were talking more about the trust. But as long as those two things are the big issues, I kind of think like we should spend more time talking about that stuff. Otherwise, we're just spinning our wheels. That's all I'm going to say on that tonight.
Is that all?
Well, why don't you do your one article if we have time? Let's I forget which one it was.
Oh yeah, just a couple quick. My 13 and 14. Udon is a domain discovery tool that finds domains based on your Google Analytics ID, which I thought was kind of neat. I hadn't considered that in evaluating an attack surface. I'm sure it's not new or really all that novel, but I was like, why didn't I think of that kind of thing?
Yeah.
Because if you can identify the same Google Analytics ID, it ties to domains, it probably all belong to the same person. So that tool talked about another tool called Nuclei, which has a ton of features with the ability to scan all kinds of different websites in various aspects. It was kind of like a pen testing, bug bounty hunter kind of assessment tool, a vulnerability scanner based on simple YAML. So you can kind of give it YAML templates and it'll go out and scan stuff. It was something I had not heard of and started playing around with this week and had some decent results just running kind of the default set of templates. But I could see me going back to this and scripting some things. So, hey, if you use those tools and you like them, you want to write in, tell us a little more, that'd be great. Maybe we'll have you on the show and talk about them more in depth. I just did a cursory look. I thought they're pretty neat. One interesting, not necessarily, it isn't a cybersecurity story, but many of us working in cybersecurity today, if you're working, may have had to sign some kind of non-compete or sign a contract that has a non-compete clause. I mean, if you're working outside of cybersecurity, you may also obviously have these clauses as well. The U.S. is targeting non-compete clauses and looking to pass legislation that would essentially ban non-compete clauses, which is, I don't know if it's going to pass. Like, I don't pretend to know what legislation is being proposed. I don't know exactly where this legislation is in the process. I don't know what chances it has of being passed because there's a lot of variables there, right? I also don't know like the ramifications, good or bad. Like, I think that there's probably a number of people working today that are kind of hindered by a non-compete clause that probably could have like really benefit from having this freedom to not be tied down from a non-compete clause. I think it tends to be larger corporations that use this to kind of pigeonhole some employees. Because like my whole thing is if you pay an employee well and treat them great, like they're probably not going to leave, right? Not everyone has a thing. But there's also the other flip side of like if you're a business and you do have intellectual property that could lead to the destruction of your business if someone left and competed with you, like that's a thing too. And how do we balance the two is kind of interesting. But I also think in my assessment, I think many will probably agree, like non-compete is kind of abused by mostly larger corporations.
100%. I mean, I don't think it will pass because I think big corporations value this and they have lots of high-powered lawyers and money to lobby to keep it from being passed. But we've all had to sign these things at some point in time. And for the most part, the ones I've signed, I didn't mind signing them, but I felt like it was being abused, because I do agree that if somebody develops specialized skills and specialized things, them taking that to the highest bidder and going to your competitor,
Yes.
even if it's just the skill set. So if somebody spends years of I mean, a lot of this came out of EDR. So EDR was H. Ross Pro's company, I think, or EDP or whatever it was. And one of the famous things about that company was that if you went to work there, they sent you to all this training and made you sign an agreement that if you quit within 2 years, you had to pay them back.
And they're talking about wiping that out in this law.
Well, they lost a lawsuit on it because they said it was indentured servitude, because people could not leave their jobs without paying, hundreds of thousands of dollars in an arbitrary amount that was determined by H. Ross Perot, who, of course, made it very high. But, I mean, I do agree that if you have some kind of elaborate special skills that have been developed in the company, being able to carry those to a competitor or start your own business or whatever is detrimental to the company. But you should be able to leave your job and not be unemployed. I mean, especially for a lot of us who are specialized. And I mean, they do this a lot in entertainment and things too. They have like celebrities and stuff, and they say, you're going to work for NBC News. We don't want you to quit and go work for ABC News. And if you quit, you can't work in a news, in a news company for 2 years or whatever.
There's a time limit associated.
And I mean, I just think that's just basically prevents people from leaving lousy jobs because they can't. And I mean, it would be like the university telling me you can't quit. If you do, you're not allowed to work at a university, for 5 years. So I'd have to get a real job, which would suck. So, I mean, I think there's a lot of
case law on this too. I mean, we should probably have one of our legal experts.
We can get Tom. I'm sure Tom will come on.
I was just thinking about Tom. We should get Tom to weigh in on this one.
I'm sure he could. Yeah.
I mean, there's tons of case law on this that is. In all the scenarios we described, right, like every situation is like slightly different. And I have heard of circumstances where it gets held up that like they can't prevent someone from working. But there's other cases where it's like, well, you can't just go destroy someone else's business either. I think those are the two.
And there's working and there's working.
Right?
I mean, exactly. Leaving your highly successful podcast job and having to bag groceries is not necessarily the same thing as I can leave this and go do something else. And there's tons and tons of cases where people said, well, you're a programmer, you can't work in technology at all, or whatever. And I think a lot of that is abused and used to basically put a stranglehold on people and force them to stay at companies where they're not treated well. Because like you said, if I work somewhere and they love me and I love them and we all work really well together, I'm not really that inclined to leave. Although even then, maybe the people down the street are paying 10 times what I'm being paid here, and it does tend to depress salaries because they know you can't leave.
Right.
So I don't need to give you a raise. What are you going to do? Leave? Okay, go ahead. You can't work in the tech. I had one. It was a consulting job, and it was ridiculous. They'd obviously boilerplated something, and I was like, I'm sorry, I can't sign this because I can't sign a statement with you saying, if you get rid of me or I quit, I can't work in the technology industry for 5 years. I'm like, this is a 1099 consulting job, guys.
Well, that's why I think this isn't necessarily like a binary issue like that. This is
it's not.
There's a lot of nuance.
Very complex,
yes.
It's not a binary issue, and there's usually ways to work around it. And since you have me on screen right now, I have to interrupt real quick to follow Twitch etiquette and thank Tiberius for rating us.
Thank you, Tiberius.
Because I'm an old person. But thank you. We've been rated on Twitch, whatever that means.
Is that the same Tiberius that was just on the Hacker Mind podcast, I wonder?
0x Tiberius. I'm just calling him Tiberius.
OSCP training stuff?
Yeah.
You're a pen tester?
But anyway, I mean, it's a very nuanced issue. It's very complex. There's lots and lots of cases and lawsuits and court battles. And I'm sure if they try to avoid it, it will also end up in lots of court cases, nuances, and so forth. So it's.
Wait, Lee, do you have a question, comment?
Oh, Lee's waving.
Actually, I did. I agree with a lot of what Doug is saying, but for example, I'm not necessarily bound by a non-compete. I am bound by a lot of non-disclosures with some very serious consequences, as Jeff once was. And I keep thinking that the people don't understand the difference between protecting their trade secrets from being reused and preventing somebody to go get another job based on the gray matter in their head.
Yeah.
And their abilities. It's very different, and that non-compete is just seems like a bastardization of protecting IP, and it just, and I know businesses worry about that bottom line and disclosing secrets, and I've seen lots of it, but I have a feeling this is going to fall apart, and hopefully backtrack to just protecting IP effectively.
Well, that would be nice, because I agree with you. I mean, if I write a piece of code for Paul and he pays me for it, it belongs to him effectively.
Depending on your contract.
Well, yeah, but if I try to take that and go work for your competitor, I personally think that's wrong.
Yeah,
I mean,
there's an ethics component to
legal
this.
or not.
Yes,
I mean, I
agree.
would think that to me that would be a wrong thing to do. And I've seen people do stuff like that. I've seen people try to do stuff that. I've had several times people try to get me involved in something that was exactly stealing intellectual property, even though they tried to work their way around it and said, "Oh, come on." But I mean, when somebody tries to tie you to a job and says you can't work in your industry, I just find that offensive and silly, and I'm really reluctant to sign that. I'll be happy to sign an intellectual property rule with somebody.
Yeah, like you can't take the source code with you when you leave,
or
and
a paper. I've worked for a company. They said I wrote all these papers, and I had to get permission to even list those papers on my resume because I had signed an agreement that this is yours, and I won't refer to it, and I won't mention it, and I won't use it anywhere else. And I completely agree with that. They paid for it; it's theirs. That's fine. But I also don't want them telling me, "Hey, yeah, but if you don't work for us, you can't work anywhere. You're going to have to go dig ditches or something." And I'm way too lazy for that.
Plus, you don't look good in orange.
I really don't. I mean, except when I'm programming, then I wear an orange spandex jumpsuit to code. It's the only way. Yeah, it's the only way.
I cannot unsee that.
Coming to the next conference.
Now I'm going to wear that to the next show. Right. So now I got to get that Borat monokini or whatever. Yeah.
Oh God.
Wow.
Can we talk about the FAA thing for just like 2 minutes?
Yeah.
Yeah, we can close out.
Yeah, let's close it. I put that story up not because it's a cybersecurity issue, but because I was really curious about it. Because I first saw that this morning, and I have all these alerts based on airline and all this stuff because I fly a lot and I get all these notifications and I want to know how bad my day is going to be. And I saw this thing this morning, and it actually started yesterday evening. And so what happened was the Nodum system. And so Nodems are, if you're a pilot, and I have a pilot's license, but I don't really fly anymore, but a Nodum is something you check. So if I'm
saying you get high, but you don't fly.
Yeah, exactly. Okay. But if I'm going to fly a plane from Providence to Chicago, I go check the Nodems for Chicago and Providence to make sure that like Chicago doesn't say because of the presidential visit there will be no air traffic between 10 and 12, Central Standard Time.
You are now my new travel agent, Doug.
Yeah. and so I check, and I subscribe to Nodems because I like to know that when I'm traveling, and I read them and they go, this is going to be a problem, and I can go ahead and proactively. But so apparently the Nodum system, which is very important to especially commercial pilots, because they can lose their license if they violate rules, and they can also get in incredibly dangerous situations if they violate rules. Like, hey, we're testing missiles over this, this area. Don't fly in this area today. I mean, they really have Nodems like that say, do not fly over the following sectors because they're testing missiles. And it's like military, don't get near it. Okay, well, that's a Nodum. So the system went down. And so for the first time since 9/11/2001, the FAA shut down all air traffic in the United States up until it went back up at 8:50 this morning. But some airports like Chicago O'Hare and some of these really busy airports were still down for hours because they couldn't get it sorted out. And, of course, you can imagine the incredible disaster this resulted in with air travel today. Well, the interesting thing about it, and the reason I brought it on the show that I noticed was President Joe Biden went on the air this morning, and he said this was not a cyber attack. And Pete Buttigieg, who's the Secretary of Transportation, went on and said this is not a cyber attack. And they said this over and over and over again, that it was some other thing, and which it may well be. I don't have it. But the interesting thing to me was one of my go-to sites is the FAA flight delay website. And this is a site that's linked to the FAA database of any kind of Nodems, posted delays, whether they're weather, whether they're military, whatever they are, and they'll tell you what's going on. And this is the FAA mandating that there's traffic control going on in New Jersey because it's raining really hard, and then you know you're going to be delayed. Well, when I went to the site, this is the interesting part. I went to the site, so if they were down, I would have expected a 404.
No data.
No data, but that's not what I got. I got a permission denied error on all of those FAA sites. And I was like, now, why would you, if you're down or your servers are down, why would you put a permission denial in on your servers? Because that would normally be what you would do in an incident response, right? Is you jump in and lock all the doors and say, somebody's in, we got to keep them out, so we're just going to turn all access off. And I'm not trying to start a conspiracy here.
Oh, but you are.
Oh, I know. But I mean, I really, I don't think they know what happened. I think they just wanted to reassure everybody that the world isn't ending and, remain calm. And I doubt Joe Biden knows very much about what a cyber attack is anyway. But it was interesting to me that their websites were all permission, denied rather than 404s and things like that. So I don't know why they were doing that. And I thought it was very, very interesting. They still have not, at the time I came to the show, they had not released any new information on it. I'm sure we'll hear more about it in the coming days.
Or not.
Until
you release your documentary on the conspiracy at the time the FAA got hacked.
So I woke up to this morning, and my wife's like, "Oh, look what's happening," because we're watching the news, and they're like, "Oh, something's happened with air traffic," and I'm like, so I started looking out on Twitter, and I'm like, does anybody talk on Twitter anymore about this? So there's a little bit of conversation. I was also on Mastodon, but I was getting equal parts. This is definitely a cyber attack, and there's no way this is a cyber attack. And I figured we would talk about it tonight. And my thought was, why don't we wait and hear a little bit about what happened rather than a lot of speculation, which is still kind of my assertion. Having worked for the government, I kind of lean towards, no, this is probably just some big, colossal screw up based on archaic aging technology and somebody goofed. And
that's what I thought.
That's been more my experience. Yeah. Is it possible that it's a cyber attack? Yeah, maybe. But given that probably until today, most people outside of the airline industry had never heard of this thing and had no idea what it was, probably wouldn't be top on the list to like, oh, I bet you this would bring down the aviation industry. So, I mean, I get what you're saying, Doug, about, not wanting to do conspiracy theory, but stuff makes you wonder. I guess my only thought based on what you were saying is, why would the websites be showing permission denied? If they didn't know what was going on and they were just reacting, wouldn't they immediately shut everything down until they knew?
So my conclusion on it was that that's probably they implemented their incident response plan because they didn't know what was happening. Somebody posted a story now on Discord that says that corrupted file was to blame. I do know all these FAA systems are really old and really dated and really clunky, and I was actually thinking maybe they just ran a bunch of updates and it just fried everything. Well, but it may well have manifested itself looking like a cyber attack, and on the better, somebody hits the red phone and says, "Hey, lock it down because we don't know what's happening, and until we do, we got to be careful here."
So a lot of my summarization is a lot of people had a really bad day traveling today.
Yeah.
I feel for them.
Oh, yeah.
But the question you have to ask is, did you set yourself on fire today? Raise your hand. If you say, I did.
I was just happy that I was the fly today.
I can't think of the last time I did that.
I was in a meeting, and my lighters all ran out of fluid. Now, fortunately,
big surprise.
In this case, unfortunately for me, I had a bunch of wooden matches that were laying on my desk.
Oh, God.
And so I took out, so the trick when you light a cigar, by the way, free advice, when you light a cigar is take two wooden matches together, light them, strike them both at the same time so they both light up. And I did that. Now I'm on a meeting with my coworkers. Fortunately, they were engrossed in a very serious conversation, were not paying attention to me. And on the meeting, I'm on the video, and I strike the match, and one of the two matches, the tip broke off that was lit on fire and landed right on my jeans and was still engulfed in flames while it was on my jeans. So I'm on the meeting going like this, stomping on the floor, putting out the fire, and they're just still engrossed in the conversation. I'm like, Did you guys even notice that? Like I just
Nobody said anything.
Set myself on fire. They're like, no, that's hilarious.
Interesting. I also was on fire today.
Get out.
In maybe the same meeting, and I also covered it well because nobody noticed.
Oh, this was my coworkers' meeting.
Oh, okay. Well, I was in another
meeting.
I was
Did you set
meeting.
yourself on fire in your tent? You were in your smoking tent.
I was in the smoking tent, and my coat. The wind or something must have got my coat over against the propane heater, and I smelled something burning, and I was like, what the hell is that? And I looked down, and there's like, it was not flames, but there was like smoke, and a big hole melted in my coat, and the down inside of it was like smoldering. And I'm like in the meeting going, yeah, and now two-factor authentication is a very interesting thing. And
but I like that I had to tell the story of myself lighting myself on fire before you admitted to setting yourself on fire.
I just hadn't thought of it.
We've been together a lot today, and you failed to mention you set
shit
yourself
like that
on fire.
happens a lot, so I don't really bring it up unless there's some germane reason. So
I need to buy a new pair of jeans, and Doug needs to buy a new coat.
I already ordered a new coat. Yeah.
Fortunately, they weren't like my favorite jeans. For like,
and I noticed an interesting effect too, because the only thing I said in front of my computer was, "Oh shit, I'm on fire," and literally, I'm not even making this up. Literally, a few minutes later, I got an email from Lands End Clothing that said 70% off. Outdoor coats.
Flame retardant outdoor clothing.
Well, yeah, if it had been a fire extinguisher ad, I would have really been scared. So an interesting day all around.
But now, mind you, Doug and I both set ourselves on fire today. And the driving factor behind that is we both had to smoke cigars today. And mine was in my office.
Pathetic
and yours
addicts,
was in
I had a cigar out of my cabin. I did not light myself on fire.
Aww.
I did drop an ash on me, but that's pretty normal.
It would have been a trifecta, Jeff.
It would not have been.
One out of three.
Sorry.
I was expecting Jeff or Lee to stand up and show a big hole burning their jeans or something. Like,
Lee, were you safe from setting yourself on fire today? You all good there?
I'm good with not setting myself on fire today, although I'm listening to this and I'm remembering, the Muppet Christmas tale. Light the lamp, not the rat. Light the lamp, not the rat.
So, right now, host on the show, 50% of us have lit.
We've been on fire today.
Yes.
It reminds me of my brother-in-law, who, when my son was probably, 10 or 12 years old, 8 or 10 years old, 4th of July, we were together, and of course, my son went out with his uncle to light fireworks, and a few minutes later,
I'm always that brother, uncle, by the way.
My brother-in-law shows up and says, we're going to go shopping for a little bit. And turns out like he lit my son's shirt on fire.
But he also fireworks without a trip to the ER.
Right.
He also, at his house, same guy, my brother-in-law, he has in his house, he has one of these little side sunroom kind of things off to the side of the house that they never really use that much. And he was setting off bottle rockets on the 4th of July, and one tilted and went through the window of this thing and just kind of bounced around inside of this room.
Oh, God.
And it was like that for a year or two until they remodeled it. So we showed up for the holiday party, months later, and let's see all the damage. And it was kind of impressive. So my brother-in-law, Pyro.
Be safe with fire. That's
right.
Be safe with fire.
Fire, alcohol, and cigars.
That's right.
Fire, long passwords, and
Well, thank you everyone for listening and watching this edition of Paul's Security Weekly. Doug, take us out.
Well, I always say it's a good day when you don't catch on fire, but it happens more often than not.
Today's not one of those days for us.
Today's not that day.